Appreciate everyone joining today for our discussion around consolidation and gastroenterology before, during, and after transaction. Today we'll touch on how transactions are being structured, major considerations for physicians and groups contemplating a transaction. I'd like to start out by just introducing the panel. We have Justin Aiello, who is a partner in MWE's Miami office. He focuses on transactions with a focus on PPM in various single specialties. Also from McDermott, Will & Elmery is Nick Alarife, who's a partner in the Washington, D.C. office and focuses on regulatory matters. Eric Major from Provident Healthcare Partners. Eric is a director at the firm, focused on various specialties in PPM, and has completed numerous transactions in gastroenterology. And I'm Michael Patton. I'm a managing director here at Provident Healthcare Partners, focused on many specialties within the physician practice management world and have completed deals within the gastroenterology space. I think we wanted to start off the conversation today just talking about kind of where the market is today and you know, how we've gotten here. Obviously, gastroenterology has been a very sweet spot for private equity groups over the last 5 years or so, beginning with the Audex's partnership with GastroHealth back in 2015. Subsequent to that time, we've seen 10 in total platforms as we sit here today in the gastroenterology space that are sponsor backed. We've seen, and even more so, we've seen 3 transactions completed during and after the COVID pandemic, which you know, further shows the interest level in the space. And we think that's being driven by, you know, steady demand for GI services, very fragmented market with a very attractive group of ancillaries. And it also brings together the site of service and the practice-based services, you know, outside of the hospital setting, which is the lower cost of care setting. We're likely to see the first exit in 2021 with it rumored that GastroHealth and Audex will be exploring a transaction, as we've seen in multiple spaces, multiple sources, and most recently an article in PE Hub. I think we'll start the questions to our panelists here. First directed at you, Eric. And how has private equity impacted the GI landscape, and where is the industry in terms of the maturity level of consolidation as we stand today?
Sure, thanks, Mike. I'll start on that, and Justin and Nick, feel free to chime in. I think you know, private equity within GI was a little bit slower to develop. You know, once GastroHealth received an investment from Audex Group, I think it was really a couple of years until we started to see you know, a steady stream of transactions. But that's really changed in the last, you know, two years or so, as a number of private equity firms have closed deals. And to Michael's point, even during the pandemic, there were still several meaningful transactions that closed in 2020. I think, you know, what we've seen with the space overall is a little bit different than other physician subspecialties. You know, we've seen that gastroenterologists have been more apt to come together through acquisitions. You know, if you compare this to spaces that we've worked in, such as dermatology or ophthalmology, it seems like most of the early groups went, you know, the route of becoming their own platform, and, you know, achieving scale for private equity backed groups in those subspecialties has been a lot more difficult. Within the GI space, we've seen some very large players emerge in a fairly short period of time. You know, GI Alliance, GastroHealth, United Digestive, you know, groups that have achieved very meaningful scale, you know, in most cases in multiple states in a pretty short period of time. So I think the industry has really evolved very quickly, especially in the last couple of years, as private equity activity has resulted in, you know, nearly a deal or even more per month within the space. And we expect that to continue. I think it's still very early on in the consolidation within the broader sector. If you kind of use the 9-inning baseball analogy, we're probably still in the second or third inning. But I think we'll continue to see, you know, private equity firms invest into new platforms within the space, and continue consolidation from some of the larger private equity backed groups that have planted a flag within certain geographies. I think they're going to start to layer in some density within those states that they're in, and also look at potentially expanding into new regions as well.
Great. Nick or Justin, anything to add there? All right.
Yeah, just hey, Justin here. No, I would just say that I'm seeing the same thing, and we're seeing a lot of deal activity in the space right now as some of the larger platforms have now come together, and they're now looking for add-ons all over the country. So I think we're seeing less platform formation at this point. I think people are more frequently joining some of the larger platforms that have been established, but there's still areas of the country that haven't been touched yet where they probably still are looking for platforms.
Great, thank you. Nick, this question I'll direct towards you. What legal steps should a practice take prior to beginning a deal process?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. Just as a note, the thoughts here that I'm going to share are just my general views and don't necessarily reflect McDermott, Will & Emery's or any of my clients. But, I generally think when it comes to the legal steps that a practice might want to think about before beginning the deal process, I do think it is wise to kind of do your own checkup, so to speak, as kind of cliche as that might be in the physician practice management space or physician practice space. But you really do want to think about that checkup on your practice and see what kind of patent issues you may have with your practice operations or latent issues. And you really just want to kick your own tires and think about the practice, the deal process as almost as if you're selling your house, and the potential buyers are the buyers of your house. They're going to hire their own inspector to take a look at the foundation, your roof, any cracks, etc. And so you want to check your own house before you go to market, just so you know what's out there and what issues might be arising. And this is particularly important in the physician practice space because, a buyer is not going to want to inherit some of the risks that can come with a Medicare number, or that we see sometimes in the theories of successor liability, even in an asset purchase transaction. So the last thing you really want to do is be surprised by anything that could come up in diligence. Of course, in the healthcare compliance space, you're always wanting to exercise good hygiene, regardless of the sale. But especially, you don't want anything to come up in this deal process where these timelines are so tight, and you really do have to get things done in an orderly fashion. So you may ask, what are the big issues that we see come up in the physician practice space? And I would lump those into, there are a couple categories, but one of the bigger ones that we definitely see in physician practices generally, and in gastroenterology as well, is regulatory compliance. And namely, I'll name a few laws that do come up are the Stark Law compliance, and kickback statute compliance, and general Medicare, Medicaid, billing and reimbursement issues. Now, why are these big issues? It really has to do with the potential of False Claims Act liabilities that practices or entities that bill to federal healthcare programs can face, and that a buyer is not going to want to inherit those liabilities from you, if there are any. And so one of the big issues we do see physician practices not struggle with, but definitely an issue is whether or not they satisfy an exception to the Stark Law. And the most important exception in the physician practice space is typically the in-office ancillary services exception, which really gets into micromanaging how practices, set up their internal physician compliance activities and physician compensation. And so the Stark Law really does not allow physician groups to credit ancillary revenues or designated health service revenues directly based on the volume or value of a physician's DHS referral. So what does that look like in real practice? It means, potentially percentage of revenue compensation can, in some instances, raise issues for whether a group practice can meet an applicable exception to the Stark law. And particularly, a lot of groups are in the GI space are pretty savvy and have engaged healthcare counsel previously. But one of the codes that, you want to make sure that all your ancillary codes are being distributed in a compliant manner. And one of the codes that we often see sometimes being put in the wrong bucket in the GI space are the pill cam endoscopy codes, as well as others. So these are things you want to just check up on before you go to practice so they don't become an issue during diligence. And generally don't raise compliance concerns. There are usually ways that these issues can be addressed and can be fixed and don't become deal killers or deal stoppers, but it's good to get in front of those issues rather than be surprised with them down the road when you're 2 days from closing. That's never an ideal situation for anybody. And we do have some new guidance from CMS that may provide some relief from having to do a self-disclosure if the issue relates to a payment discrepancy or some other issue with regard to how the payment was effectuated that may not have been in line with your contracts, but it's a nuanced issue, and so you want to get in front of it. There may be a way to avoid that self-disclosure, and if you do end up having to self-disclose, it's usually pennies on the dollar. But these are all issues that we see come up in the legal space during these deals, and we think it's better to get ahead of them rather than have them come and be an issue right at the end of the deal. So those are some issues that I typically see. Justin, any other thoughts from your perspective or other panelists?
Yeah, I think on that specific regulatory issue, for example, the paying compliant compensation, we see that messed up, 50 to 70% of the time, and it's really not a big deal to fix. You just need to get counsel that understands how you can distribute DHS compensation in a compliant manner, and it's something like Nick said that you can fix for pennies on the dollar versus a buyer finding it out in the course of diligencing a transaction and perhaps wanting to take the more conservative route of doing an overpayment refund, which would of course be far more expensive. But in addition to regulatory issues, there's a significant amount of corporate diligence issues that you can get ahead of. At the outset, I'd say, get your cap table in order. Who are the shareholders of the business being sold? Who should they be when you finally get to a sale? Do you have any physicians that are retiring in the months leading up to the sale? Do you have any physicians that are being promoted to partner in the months leading up to the sale? And how does that impact the final distribution of proceeds at the closing of the transaction? Your options are going to be limited depending on the tax entity or the entity type and tax classification in terms of being able to shift around proceeds to the physicians that perhaps feel like they deserve a greater share of the proceeds because they've founded the practice and they've put their blood, sweat, and tears in it versus the new associate that's come in and has been recently promoted and is working super hard, but maybe doesn't feel as deserving of the practice that's been around for 15 years and is finally being sold. And so obviously also new physician associates being promoted to partner raises long-term capital gain tax issues, and limitations under the Stark law prohibit shifting proceeds to the highest producers because they're the highest producers, because that'd be paying in a manner that fluctuates with the volume or value of referrals. So those are a couple things at the outset, super high level that you should look at. Another thing is to look at some of your significant contracts. Maybe Provident can tell us how often they see third-party management companies that either manage the practice or manage an ASC that's being sold with the practice, and then that complicates transactions. You want to know that at the outset. You want to be able to tell your buyer that at the outset. Because of corporate practice in medicine, the private equity sponsor is going to be making a management company that's going to manage your practice. They can't buy your practice directly. And so if you already have an exclusive third-party manager, that kind of limits your options in terms of going out to market. I don't know if you guys see that a lot, Eric, on the practice side. I'm sure on the ASC side, it's more popular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the GI space in particular, I think there's certainly going to be a fair amount of groups that have, divested ownership interest within anesthesia entities to some corporate buyers, or perhaps on the endoscopy center side have joint ventures with certain ASC management companies that I think in the context of the transaction, it impacts how you kind of go to market and what revenue streams and profit streams are included in the deal, what are excluded, how does that impact, shareholder compensation, really all those dynamics kind of go hand in hand with the legal side as well.
Yeah, it's worth like taking a look at some of your other contracts too, to see if there are any provisions that would get in the way of the transaction. For example, on at least one occasion, I've seen a health plan have a right of first refusal to buy a practice. And so that was a pretty big wrench thrown into the transaction. In other instances, you have non-competes, owed to different parties. And so you want to have an understanding of the universe of those types of contractual restrictions, people with options, different types of options to buy in the company. And some minor one, for example, just to save the corporate lawyers some trouble, is if you have any leases coming up for renewal and you can slip in a change of control right without getting the consent of the landlord, you'll save yourself many obnoxious phone calls and emails.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think the next question goes to a little bit of what Justin was talking about, as to people at the different considerations of different people at different parts of their career, from those at the beginning, middle, and end of their career, and what are the considerations from those people, whether it's a new partner to someone that's much closer to retirement to someone that's in the middle, and kind of what does a transaction mean to them. So Eric, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think the reality of the way that most GI practices are set up that we've encountered, typically you have an ownership structure that is most often equal, and every physician is either a partner or on a partnership track, with maybe some exceptions. And obviously, I think that's a pretty traditional setup for a physician practice in general. A lot of people kind of go into deals thinking that this really only works for the partners that are at the end of their careers that are looking to retire in the next 5 years. And certainly, I think the economics make a lot of sense for someone who's within 5 years of retirement, but that doesn't mean that the economics can't make sense for people that are just becoming partners and everyone in between. What we kind of work through on our deals is showing the, what we call break-even analyses, which are really putting together an illustration for partners at varying stages, to really understand, how do I compare the potential deal proceeds from the deal, in terms of cash at close, rollover equity, what the upside in that rollover equity might look like, and how do I compare that to what the status quo would have been if we didn't go through this transaction, if I continued on as a partner in an independent, group. And, those types of illustrations I think are critical just for especially younger partners, to allow them to kind of get their hands around what this means just from a pure economic perspective. And I think a lot of these discussions around private equity do start, with economics, because if the economics don't make sense, then most groups really don't pursue the deal much further. But, I think the first thing is understanding, can the economics make sense for partners at varying stages of their career? And, certainly for larger groups, with the valuations that are on the market today, I think the economics can be very attractive for people of all ages. And then from there, really taking it a step further of, how do we find the right partner where someone who's in the early stages of their career can get excited to go to work every day and feels like there's, a lot of upside for the group, based on the partnership that they're, with the private equity firm or the strategic acquirer that they're aligning with. So I think those kind of go hand in hand in terms of some of the qualitative aspects of the deal, as well as really the economic points that seem to really be a sticking point, particularly for people that are mid-career or just became partners within the last few years.
Great. Justin or Nick, anything to add there?
I'll leave that to the bankers, as that's a pretty straight economic consideration for the most part.
Sounds good. I think the next
Yeah, you
question
can
is
usually find
directed.
something that works from a regulatory perspective with regard to the compensation, regardless of mid-tier. So I'll also pass that one along.
The next question is directed at you, Justin, and it relates to the differences of, you know, being a platform transaction versus joining one of the other companies that already has a private equity investment. So, you know, what are the kind of the pros and cons to being, you know, a gastro health where you're the first acquisition when as a platform, or kind of joining them after they've made that initial acquisition and everything's been put into place?
So I'll kind of talk about the pros and cons of setting up, you know, establishing a new platform. And I think that they're pretty general, you know, for the most part, they're generally flipped when you think of an established, and the cons turn into the pros and vice versa. So on a new MSO, if you're setting up a new MSO, you're architecting the platform. You have say into almost everything. You're going to get the best economics and governance terms. You're going to have the most control rights. You're going to have board seats. You know, the 10th add-on coming in is going to have very limited say in the governance of the platform. And so I think you're set up to kind of have have a lot of say in different things. Of course, that comes with it a lot of expense, a lot of time, you know, thinking through all of these different issues and working with your new financial sponsor and determining what the rules of the road are. And there's a little bit of risk as well, because this is a brand new platform. I think that, you know, working with any of the private equity sponsors that our firm deals with, I haven't seen anything go wrong, really. They all are very sophisticated and understand these spaces and know what they're doing. So I think the risk is not super high, but it's lower than, of course, an MSO that's been established for 5 years. And then when you look at an established MSO, it's flipped a little bit, right? The terms are dictated to you. This is what the governance document is. You're stepping into it. These are the terms on dilution, preemptive rights, tag and drag rights, and so you have a little bit less say. Of course, and maybe Eric can speak to this, is a lot of platforms are setting up sub MSOs within the platform, and so you might have a lot of control. You might actually still be able to find a way to get a lot of control over a regional MSO that governs your area, but you may not have as much control or say in the national platform. And then I think, you know, the pros of an established one: lower risk, it's more efficient. You're going to save time and money because a lot of these things have been spelled out for you already, and you just have to learn what they are and get plugged in. What do you think, Eric? Do you see that a lot in the GI space? The sub
Yeah, I
MSO?
mean, I think in particular, you know, there's different terminology used. We kind of look at, you know, a regional platform deal, which is sort of a hybrid between, you know, what someone thinks is as an add-on deal, which would be, you know, a practice that's in your local state or local market, you know, versus a true platform deal, which would be the starting point for an investor. You know, we kind of look at regional platform deals, which there's been several examples of those so far within the GI sector, and really categorize those deals as a new state or, you know, a brand new region of the United States for an existing private equity backed platform, where, you know, the governance maybe in the top go, or the top board, maybe the regional platform might not have a presence on that board, but they'll be given certain autonomies within that region itself. So it can be an attractive hybrid option for groups that you know, that don't necessarily want to join someone who's in their backyard, but also, you know, don't view the risk building a platform on their own enough to warrant going down that road. And so I think that type of option has seemed to really resonate with GI practices across the country, as you can point to a number of regional platform deals that have been completed in the last couple of years.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think from the regulatory standpoint, I guess I would just say too, they probably have all of all the varying options for paying compensation compliant manners that kind of will give you the menu of options. So that's just, you know, another benefit versus having to come up with all that on the front end.
Great. I guess this is back to you, Eric, is, you know, how does a group determine when is the best timing of when to go to market? I know that's a question that we deal with our clients quite regularly. Is this the right time?
Yeah, I think I can touch on that, and then would be interested to hear Justin and Nick's thoughts too, just on the legal front. But I think, you know, there's a couple different considerations you have. There's really the macro considerations, which, you know, thinking about, you know, what are the valuations in the market, you know, the interest rate environment, our investors, you know, out there putting money to work, you know, 2020 being an example of obviously a time where a lot of groups pulled back from the market, you know, and tax implications too, you know, especially in the context of potentially changes to capital gains, you know, that has to be considered as well. And then I think the other part of it is really considerations specific to the company itself. So some of the dynamics we talked about around retiring partners, partnership track doctors, you know, that oftentimes leads to, you know, some considerations around the timing of exploring a deal. I think the number one thing that comes up in groups we're talking with is just, you know, the growth. You know, most of the groups that we work with and have seen in the GI industry are in the middle of a growth phase. And, you know, especially with the, you know, the patient demand that's there and the aging population, you know, there's more patients, you know, coming through the door, and practices are typically looking to, you know, to grow, and might be in the middle of opening a new location, or, you know, they've onboarded several, you know, doctors within the last year. And, you know, they want to make sure that that growth is considered in the context of their deal. I think the consideration there oftentimes, though, you know, the question to a group is, if you're growing now, you know, will you be growing a year from now? And usually the answer is yes. I mean, most practices are always in a growth phase. So it's a matter of, you know, making sure that the deal is structured in a way where you get credit for short-term growth initiatives of the business. And there's different ways you can kind of model that financially in the business. Obviously, putting together pro forma adjustments, looking at, you know, projections for the group, and really showing an investor what the organic and de novo growth potential is of the business before their injection of capital. And ultimately, you know, the goal of a transaction obviously is none of these deals are 100% buyouts, you know, with very rare exceptions, unless it's a single doctor, single owner practice with a retiring physician. You know, all of the physician deals we've worked on, especially in the GI sector, have required a minimum rollover amount for the doctors. And, you know, you have to look at the upside potential of that rollover equity. You know, you think about a deal as a way to take some chips off the table, but, you know, if you find the right partner, the right investor who can help amplify your growth, you know, the rollover equity that you have in the business can become very meaningful going forward as well. So it's really just bridging the gap on, you know, the growth of the business in, you know, in the context of some of those macroeconomic considerations, and, you know, structuring the deal in a way where, you know, you get, you know, meaningful cash at close to reward the owners of the business today, but also provide the group with enough upside through their rollover equity that, you know, they can continue to benefit from future growth.
Yeah, those are great points, Eric. And I would just add, and it's not purely a legal perspective, but I think a lot of the benefit that partnering can do with a growing practice, regardless of exactly, you know, the situation, is help with that, the building out of, you know, ancillary lines and direction, and to get to that next level in a compliant manner. And they have that expertise to get you there, and to do it in the right way. That you know, makes, I think, partnering very, very attractive to maybe a founding physician. That partnership can be very, very helpful as you work with somebody to take yourself and your practice to the next level.
You know, one other point on the growth aspect is, you know, evaluate the status of your business, as Eric is saying. If you're an acquisitive practice, perhaps you're doing in addition to de novos, you're actually doing some of your own M&A prior to going to market. a buyer, you may or may not get full credit for pipeline M&A under LOI, but not closed. So that's one, check the timing of these deals. Is it reasonable to assume that they're going to close in a certain amount of time? You don't want to delay going to market for longer than is necessary to get the best deal. But if there's some transactions that are about to close, you may want to wait a minute to get them integrated. And so I think that's one additional consideration. Another is, are you dealing with any significant regulatory issues at the moment? Almost all regulatory issues can be worked through by allocating risk via the indemnification provisions in the purchase agreement with escrows and holdbacks and things like that. But perhaps you have, certain matters that are going to be resolved within the next couple of months, and you can put those to bed and tie them up with a nice bow and tell the buyer, hey, we had this issue, but we resolved it, and then here's how we did it. And so I think those are other things to consider. And finally, to take a look at, again, the cap table and see the status of everyone's ownership. Is somebody about to walk out the door? Is there someone that was promoted to partner 11 months ago? Let's get them to the 12 months so we can get them long-term capital gains treatment. Just some minor little things.
Great. I think we're going to pivot to the structure of these transactions, and we'll just say to the participants, to the extent that you have questions after we wrap up here, we'll leave some time for Q&A. So there's a box at the bottom if you have specific questions that you want to ask. The next question goes back to, and it's one of the biggest discussion points when we're kind of looking at these groups, is how do you set the compensation scrape and what revenue streams are included and how this varies by market. And this typically, and it's not, typically all practices are distributing all of their income at the end of the year. So creating the EBITDA to do these transactions with private equity come back to what the compensation scrape is. And Eric, if you could touch on that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's some different models that we've seen amongst some of the PE-backed consolidators in the GI sector. Some that use kind of a compensation scrape type model, others that actually use more of a productivity-based model tied professional fees with ancillary bonuses, done in a compliant way. I'll throw that in for Nick. But what we typically see as it relates to shareholder compensation and the structure of it, I think that the first point kind of goes back to what Justin mentioned earlier around just potential corporate partners that you might have in some of your entities that the physicians are owners in. So typically real estate is not included in a deal, but when you look at other areas such as endoscopy centers, anesthesia, pathology, other ancillary services like infusion, and then, the professional services, I think the starting point is understanding what could potentially be included as part of the transaction. If there's a joint venture on the endoscopy center or centers, or if there's a joint venture on anesthesia or any of the other ancillaries, it can make it a little bit more challenging to include that as part of the deal. But you really have to look at the shareholder compensation scrape and the structure post-close, based on what is going to be included in the transaction. And oftentimes this is a discussion that you have to have upfront with the partners to really understand, what they're looking for as it relates to their compensation and what they're comfortable including as part of the deal. Most investors want to be fully aligned where they have interests across all of the different ancillary service lines, facility fees, professional fees. They want to have an interest because they want to be fully aligned with the doctors going forward. But to the extent that's not possible, given some, corporate relationships that a practice might have, you might have to just look at structuring the compensation scrape based on, the ancillaries and professional fees that could be included as part of the deal. And this does vary by market. We typically look at, the resulting compensation for the partners. You have to do a check and make sure that compensation package per partner is at least at or above market. If there's a health system competitor in the market and they're paying, 20% higher than the partner compensation that they'll achieve post-closing, that creates a lot of risk, because ultimately, post-transaction, after non-competes expire and other things, physicians could potentially leave if they're underpaid. So really the compensation model has to be structured in a way where shareholders are still incentivized, they're still paid at or above market, and are excited to come to work every day. And I think that's the starting point of kind of building the adjusted EBITDA that you go to market with, is really developing a compensation model that is sustainable, that creates alignment with the investor, and provides adequate compensation for all the partners.
Great. Nick or Justin, anything as it relates to kind of the legal side of things, and when you're looking at this compensation scrape and making sure that that's compliant moving forward? I know you touched on that earlier.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think there are definitely different ways to structure these models to work from that perspective. They do get in with specialty practices and specialties. We do see these comp models become increasingly complex, so it's sometimes hard to track each and every slice and dice. But there's definitely flexibility with how a practice and a sponsor may want to consider getting to a result that works for both the sellers and the buyers, and is in everyone's interest. So there is flexibility within a compliant framework that both parties can take advantage of, and we've seen both models that Eric kind of mentioned earlier regarding the scrape and the ancillaries work in practice.
Great. Justin, I'll direct this at you, or just as it relates to what are the key legal items, both at the LOI stage and then what to expect in the definitive agreement stage. I know, obviously there's not everything can be in the letter of intent, so maybe just bifurcating, those two things.
Yeah, and a little bit of dealer's choice there. Some people like to get lots of terms in the LOI. But I think generally you expect to see the expected rollover percentage, the terms around the rollover, the terms around, or at least some basic terms around any redemption rights, which I think we'll talk about in later in this webinar. And then other financial terms should be set out, including the impact on the purchase price, like contingent payments. We talked earlier about pipeline M&A. Maybe you have payments held back that are going to be paid down the line when a deal closes. You may have earnouts if they can be done in a compliant manner, which is super difficult, of course, in the healthcare space. And a lot of times you'll have parameters around escrows, and including both indemnity escrows and working capital escrows. Maybe you'll have terms around whether working capital escrows are sole recourse for any disputes there, or collars that limit exposure to the sellers if they don't get working capital quite right. I think you often see the basics about the go-forward employment arrangement, including comp and benefits and any severance that's going to be offered, and sometimes you'll have language discussing the treatment of employees of the practice after the closing. A lot of times these founders don't want, there's maybe the perception that private equity is here to cut all costs, but it's not what I've seen in practice. And a lot of times I see promises to keep employees in place through the closing and keep comp and benefits at least where they're at prior to the closing for some period of time after the closing. And then, most importantly, from the legal perspective, you'll have at least some idea of what the indemnity construct is going to be. If it's going to be an RWI deal, which is rep and warranty insurance, which is becoming increasingly popular and available for and used in most transactions over certain sizes where it makes sense to get it. And you'll have some basic terms if it's not an RWI deal about how indemnity and risk will be allocated between the parties in terms of what percentage of purchase price is recoverable for different types of breaches under the agreement. And so that's all kind of at the LOI stage. And then in the definitive agreements, actually, I guess one other important thing at the LOI stage is probably restrictive covenants will be spelled out. And we can talk about what those generally look like, but sellers are usually going to be asked to give 3, one for the sale of their business, it's going to be generally 5 years for an area defined with reference to how the business looks at the closing. Another one in respect of their employment, which will have some tail after termination, and then a final one in respect of their equity ownership, which will have some tail from the termination of their membership interest in that company. And then the definitive agreements is just all the detail around all of those and some other boring things that I don't think I need to walk through on the call.
Nick or Eric, anything else to add to that?
No, I think Justin hit the marks there on what we can expect from the always fun and interesting insurance and rep and warranty provisions.
Okay, this is directed towards you, Eric, just as far as, one of the big things and the big concerns for groups, both groups that are selling and the partners that they're partnering with is ways to be successful in recruiting physicians post transaction, and what are the different ways that you've seen that done?
Yeah, I think I think you kind of separate partnership track doctors into a couple different categories. Those that are, within a year becoming a partner at the time of a transaction, and those that are, maybe just recently hired or are scheduled to be hired within the next, few years post close. Typically, our clients will consider, a transaction bonus for those that are nearing partnership, so that they can get, the opportunity to, on a post-tax basis, get some equity within the private equity-backed company at close. And that's really just to make sure that those that, are within a year becoming a partner don't feel like the rug has been swept out from under them, because of this transaction. They, just to make sure that they feel incentivized, have skin in the game, and are able to benefit from, the upside growth of the company that they become owners in at closing. Those that are, recently hired or will be hired post-transaction, I think, very similar to what practices do today, you have to provide them with a path to getting, partner level compensation. So going back to how the compensation pool is created and the compensation scrape, assuming everything is done where, the resulting compensation for the partners is at or above market, then, you provide an opportunity for those new physicians to, after, maybe 2 or 3 years with the practice, have the opportunity to enter into the partner compensation pool and, typically get access to, ancillary income and, even endo income as well, which provides, upside for them on their compensation. And then on the equity side of things, we've seen typically groups will provide an opportunity for those physicians to buy in, to get ownership interest within the, the MSO or the private equity backed company, to provide them with, skin in the game, just like the other partners have as well. So, typically 2 different levels. It's really partner level compensation for those new physicians and new recruits, and then also the opportunity to buy into the equity of the PE-backed MSO as well.
Great.
Justin or Nick, if you've seen other structures just around partnership track doctors and how you typically see that structured.
I think you summarized it well, and I think the MSO equity can be further divided up into, or not divided up. We should just note that there's generally 2 ways to get equity in a company. There's hard equity, you put money, you subscribe for, you pay money for, and then profits interest, and there's compliance risk and regulatory issues around issuing profits interest into the MSO. So, if there's ever any offers for equity in MSO, they're generally going to require some buy-in by the physician in order to avoid a value for nothing exchange that would trip up anti-kickback issues.
That's right. You just want to be careful with how you structure those buy-ins and make sure, as Justin just mentioned, you're doing it in a way that mitigates any risk from a federal or state level law perspective.
Great. Justin, I'll direct this to you. One of the things that we've seen, more recently, not only in gastroenterology, but kind of across the practice management, deal flow is clawbacks as it relates to physicians leaving before a certain amount of time. What type of structures have you seen on clawbacks out there?
Yeah, it is definitely common, and at the highest level, it's a good lever, bad lever, really bad lever scenarios is kind of the spectrum. Good lever, gonna get bought out, and I guess that's not even really a clawback in that instance, but you'd probably get bought out at fair market value, which would either be determined by the board or perhaps a third-party appraiser, or sometimes a preset multiple of even trailing 12-month EBITDA construct. But then you have the bad lever scenario, which is generally discount off of that good lever price. Often see 50%, that's negotiable, of course. And then the really bad lever scenario is you breach your non-compete and you start competing with the sponsor who just paid a lot of money to acquire your business or the rights to your business. And that's generally where you see the forfeiture type mechanisms for, buyback for $1 all your equity.
Yeah, and I think this becomes a big sticking point with groups that we work with. But ultimately, I think everyone, if you're considering a transaction and you hear about these kind of good lever, bad lever scenarios, the seller should also recognize that, when a deal is completed, it's also meant to protect their equity as well. It's not just to the benefit of the private equity firm. Ultimately, the only reason why, or one of the reasons why, investing in physician groups doesn't work out is you have physicians that become unmotivated and and unproductive post closing or not going to work every day. Those types of kind of disaster type scenarios are being mitigated by these clawback provisions. So while it's a tough pill to swallow as a seller in a transaction, you also should recognize that on the back end, when the private equity backed MSO is going out and acquiring another practice, these types of clawback provisions are meant to really protect all of the owners of the company, including the physicians themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to follow up, maybe I should elaborate too on bad lever. Like that could be, for example, breaching any cause provision in your employment agreement. That's not the non-compete. And at the end of the day, there is you're still getting bought back at some value, but you are taking away from the business because they're having to terminate you all of the EBITDA that you contributed that went toward the purchase price for which you were paid a multiple. And so that's why it is a tough pill to swallow, but I think why it's often ends up finding its way into the documents anyway, because it's one of the stronger protections for private equity sponsors who are paying huge multiples at this time.
And it's important to remember the alignment issue too here. You are, Derek mentioned, going to be at some level on the same team going forward, and you want these to be generally involved if this is on the other foot and on some other position. So I think it's an important piece there to consider as well, that you're both aligned on this issue at some level.
Great feedback, everyone. I think I'll touch base on kind of where we think kind of the industry is going the next 5 years, and you guys can chime in afterwards, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. But I think appreciate everyone's comments. I think what we've seen over the last 6 years or so, and the current 10 private equity backed platforms that are currently out there, I think we'll continue to see significant demand for add-ons. I think we could even see some of the private equity backed platforms coming together over the next 5 years from now. Ancillaries will likely lead to more value-based contracting, and I think there was a recent change that was announced as far as the American Cancer Society colorectal screenings being reduced from 50 to 45. And there being a higher prevalence of GI issues, that just demand overall will continue to see activity in this market and demand by private equity sponsors. Eric, Justin, Nick, and any other commentary that you'd like to add as we wrap up here?
if deal flow for the first quarter of this year is any indication on how busy the market will be, it's we're headed for lots of work for everyone and lots of deals to be done. Just want to thank you guys for inviting me and Nick onto the panel with you. I was happy to have a reason to put a shirt on the button today, so appreciate it.
Eric, anything?
No, I mean, I think you hit on it. You know, I agree with Justin. I mean, going into this year, you know, we've seen a lot of deal flow pick up. I mean, there were several transactions in the GI sector that closed really in the latter half of 2020, deals that were probably, you know, pre-pandemic transactions that, you know, were, you know, had some delayed closings. And then we've seen that kind of trickle into 2021 as well. But, you know, I think what's probably more encouraging is we're seeing new processes that are going to market within the GI sector. We're seeing, you know, new platform investments form. You know, in the last, you know, few months, there's another platform deal that occurred in the Midwest. So I think if anything, like we talked about, we're still, you know, early innings of consolidation within the GI space, and expect that activity to continue at a pace this year relative to last year.
Good. Well, it does not look like we have any open questions at this point, so I think we'll conclude here. Just want to thank you know, Eric, Justin, and Nick for all their insights, and to the extent that anyone has any follow-ups that they'd like to take offline, they can feel free to reach out to any of us.
That's great.
Appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.